The boy whispered during prayer, "Mommy can't stand." What the pastor did moved everyone. In a small-town church where silence carries the weight of unspoken prayers, a young boy's trembling whisper during Sunday service shatters the sacred quiet. His words, incomplete, desperate, directed at no one and everyone, reach the ears of a pastor who has spent years listening to confessions but has never heard a cry quite like this. What unfolds is not a miracle in the traditional sense, but something far more human, a collision of brokenness, compassion, and the kind of courage that only emerges when we stop pretending everything is fine. This is a story about what happens when someone finally listens, not with judgment, not with scripture, but with the rarest gift of all, presence. Stay until the end, because what the pastor does will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, family, and the silent battles fought in the pews around you. If this story touches your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so more people can experience moments that remind us why compassion matters. The church on Maple Street had stood for 87 years, its white paint peeling in gentle curls like the pages of an old hymnal left too long in the sun. Every Sunday morning, it filled with the same faces, faces that had learned to smile through sorrow, to nod through doubt, to sing with voices that trembled not from age but from the effort of holding too much inside. The light came through the stained glass in shafts of amber and blue, painting the wooden pews with colors that seemed borrowed from another world, a world where everything broken could be made whole again simply by sitting in the right light. But light, no matter how beautiful, cannot mend what refuses to be seen. In the third row from the back, on the left side where the morning sun never quite reached, sat a woman named Elaine with her son, Daniel. She held her purse on her lap like a shield, her fingers worrying the clasp open and shut, a rhythm she didn't know she'd adopted until it became the only sound louder than her heartbeat. Daniel was 7 years old, small for his age, with eyes that seemed too large for his face, eyes that watched everything and revealed nothing. He wore a button-up shirt that was slightly too big, the sleeves folded back twice at the cuffs, and his shoes were polished to a shine that suggested someone cared very much about appearances. But if you looked closely, if you allowed yourself to see past the surface, you would notice the way his shoulders curved inward, the way his hands stayed folded so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. Pastor Grayson stood at the pulpit, his voice steady and warm, the kind of voice that had carried thousands of sermons, baptisms, and eulogies. He was a man in his late 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and tears witnessed in equal measure. He had been the shepherd of this congregation for 23 years, and in that time he had learned to read the room the way a sailor reads the sea, watching for the subtle shifts, the quiet warnings, the moments when calm surfaces hit dangerous currents beneath. Today, as he spoke about grace and the mysteries of faith, he felt it, a disturbance, faint but undeniable, like a stone dropped into still water. The sermon rolled on, familiar and comforting, about the idea that we are never truly alone, that even in our darkest valleys, there walks beside us a presence we cannot always name but can sometimes feel. The congregation murmured their agreement, nodding along, some with eyes closed, some staring at the cross suspended above the altar, some simply going through the motions because that's what Sunday required. And then came the moment for silent prayer. That sacred pause when each person could speak to God in the privacy of their own heart, when the noise of the world was supposed to fall away and leave only the whisper of the soul. The silence settled over the room like snow, soft and heavy. Heads bowed, eyes closed, breath slowed. And in that silence, so quiet that it should have been swallowed by the vastness of the sanctuary, a small voice broke through. Not loud, not clear, but desperate in the way that only a child's voice can be when it has finally reached the edge of what it can carry alone. "Mommy can't stand." The words hung in the air, unfinished, trembling, as though the boy had spoken them without meaning to, as though they had escaped from someplace too deep to control. No one moved. No one looked up, but everyone heard. And in that moment, something invisible but essential shifted in the room. like the first crack in ice that has frozen too thick for too long. The silence that followed Daniel's whisper was not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of held breath, of hearts that stuttered mid-beat, of minds that suddenly snapped to attention because something fragile had just shattered in a place where everything was supposed to be safe. Pastor Grayson's eyes opened slowly, not in alarm, but in focus, the way a hunter's eyes open when he senses movement in the underbrush. He did not lift his head immediately. He did not want to startle the moment, to cause it to retreat back into hiding. Instead, he let his gaze travel across the rows of bowed heads, searching for the source of the sound, and when his eyes landed on the small boy in the third row, he saw what no one else had allowed themselves to see. Daniel's face was pale, his lips pressed together so tightly they had lost their color. His eyes were squeezed shut, but tears leaked from the corners, tracing silent paths down his cheeks. His mother sat beside him, rigid, her hand resting on his shoulder in a way that looked like comfort but felt like control. Elaine's jaw was clenched, her breathing shallow, and though her eyes were closed, Pastor Grayson could see the tension radiating from her like heat from a flame. She had heard her son's words. She knew what they meant, and she was praying with the kind of desperation that comes not from faith but from fear that faith might not be enough. The pastor's mind moved quickly, sorting through years of training, instinct, and experience. He had seen this before, not this exact situation perhaps, but the shape of it, the shadow it cast. He had seen families smile through service and then dissolve into chaos the moment they reached the parking lot. He had seen children carry burdens no child should carry, had seen mothers hold together fractured homes with nothing but will and weariness. He had learned that the church was not always a place of healing. Sometimes it was simply a place to hide, to pretend, to perform goodness for an audience that demanded it. And he had learned that if he wanted to truly help, he had to step carefully, had to reach without grasping, had to offer without imposing. He finished the prayer in a voice that was softer than before, gentler, as though speaking to someone on the edge of a cliff. Lord, we lift up to you the burdens we cannot name, the struggles we carry in silence, the pain we hide even from ourselves. Grant us the courage to be seen, the strength to be honest, and the grace to accept help when it is offered. Amen. The congregation echoed the amen, and the spell of silence broke. People shifted, cleared their throats, opened their eyes, and returned to the familiar rhythm of the service. But Pastor Grayson's attention never left the third row. As the final hymn began, he made his way down from the pulpit, moving through the aisle with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He shook hands, smiled, asked about grandchildren and jobs and health, but his path was deliberate, curving subtly toward the back of the church where Elaine was already gathering her things, her movements quick and mechanical. Daniel stood beside her, small and still, his eyes fixed on the floor. The pastor approached slowly, his expression open and kind, and when he spoke, his voice carried no judgment, no demand, only an invitation. Elaine, he said gently, it's good to see you this morning. And Daniel, he crouched down slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. I'm glad you're here, son. Daniel looked up briefly, his eyes meeting the pastor's for just a moment before darting away. There was something in that glance, something raw and unguarded, that confirmed what Pastor Grayson had already suspected. This child was carrying something too heavy, and he had no idea how to set it down. Elaine forced a smile, the kind of smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Thank you, Pastor. We should be going. Lots to do today. She placed a hand on Daniel's back, urging him toward the door, but the pastor didn't step aside. He didn't block her path, but he didn't make it easy either. He stood there, present, waiting, and in that waiting, he communicated something words could not. I see you. I hear you. You don't have to run. I wonder, the pastor said, his tone casual but his eyes serious, if I might speak with you both for just a moment. Nothing formal. Just a quick conversation before you head out. Elaine's smile faltered. Her grip on Daniel's shoulder tightened. We really should. But before she could finish, Daniel spoke again, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the shuffle of departing congregants. "Mommy can't stand up sometimes." The words fell between them like stones into water, and this time there was no taking them back. Elaine's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked down at her son, and for a moment, Pastor Grayson saw something flicker across her face. Fear, shame, anger, love, all tangled together into a knot so tight it seemed impossible to unravel. Daniel looked up at his mother, his expression not defiant, but simply honest, as though he had finally said the thing that had been pressing against his ribs for so long he couldn't breathe around it anymore. The pastor straightened, his heart heavy, but his resolve firm. "Why don't we step into my office for a moment?" he suggested, his voice calm and steady. "Just for a few minutes. No pressure. I think it might help." Elaine hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door, toward freedom, toward the escape she so desperately wanted. But then she looked at her son again, at the way his small hand had reached out and taken hers, at the way he was looking at her not with accusation, but with hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally help them carry what they could no longer carry alone. And so, she nodded. It was the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but it was enough. Pastor Grayson led them through the sanctuary, past the emptying pews and the stained glass and the cross that had watched over so many broken hearts, and into a small office at the back of the building. The room was simple: a desk, a few chairs, a bookshelf lined with theology texts and novels, and a framed photograph of the pastor's late wife. He gestured for them to sit, and they did. Elaine perched on the edge of her chair like a bird ready to take flight, Daniel beside her, his feet dangling above the floor. The pastor closed the door softly and took his seat across from them. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle, let it become less frightening and more like a blanket, something that could hold them without smothering them. And then, when he sensed the moment was right, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Daniel, thank you for trusting me with your words. That took a lot of courage." The boy blinked, surprised, as though no one had ever called him courageous before. "Can you tell me more about what you meant when you said your mommy can't stand?" Daniel looked at his mother, seeking permission, seeking safety. Elaine's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, but she didn't stop him. She didn't say no. And so, slowly, haltingly, the boy began to speak. "Sometimes Mommy drinks the stuff in the bottles," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ones in the cabinet. And then she gets really tired and can't stand up. She says she's fine, but she's not. She falls down sometimes. And I try to help her, but I'm not strong enough." The words poured out of him, each one a small stone lifted from his chest, and as he spoke, Elaine's composure crumbled. Her hands came up to cover her face, and her shoulders began to shake. She didn't make a sound, but the tears came anyway, hot and silent, the kind of tears that had been held back for so long they no longer knew how to fall gently. Pastor Grayson reached across the desk and gently placed a box of tissues within her reach, but he didn't speak. He simply let her break, because breaking was sometimes the first step toward healing. Daniel watched his mother cry, his own eyes filling with tears, and without thinking, he reached over and took her hand. "It's okay, Mommy," he whispered. "It's okay." And in that moment, Pastor Grayson understood that this child had been parenting his parent, had been holding together a world that should have been holding him. The weight of it was staggering, the injustice of it profound. And yet here he was, this small boy with two large eyes and two tight fists, offering comfort to the person who should have been comforting him. The pastor waited until Elaine's sobs subsided into quiet, shuddering breaths. Then he spoke, his voice low and kind. "Elaine, I want you to know that you are not alone in this. What you're facing, it's not a moral failure. It's a struggle, and struggles require help, not shame. There is no judgment in this room. There is only the offer of support, if you're willing to accept it." Elaine looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and raw. "I've tried to stop," she said, her voice breaking. "I've tried so many times. But it's the only thing that makes the pain go away. The only thing that makes me forget, even for a little while." What pain? The pastor asked gently. Elaine's hands twisted in her lap, wringing the tissue she'd taken into a tight knot. Everything, she said. My husband left 2 years ago. He just walked out one day and never came back. I lost my job 6 months after that. We're barely keeping the house. I'm so tired, Pastor. I'm so tired of pretending I'm okay when I'm not. I'm tired of being strong when I feel like I'm falling apart. And I know I'm failing Daniel. I know I am, but I don't know how to stop. Pastor Grayson nodded slowly, his heart aching for this woman who had been carrying so much for so long. You're not failing him, Elaine. You're here. You brought him to church. You're sitting in this office, having one of the hardest conversations of your life because part of you, some brave, stubborn part, wants things to be different. That's not failure. That's hope. He paused, letting the words settle. And hope is the beginning of change. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a pamphlet, along with a handwritten list of phone numbers. These are resources, he explained. Support groups, counseling services, people who specialize in helping families navigate addiction and recovery. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to ask you to consider reaching out to them. You don't have to do this alone. And Daniel. He turned to the boy, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. You don't have to carry this alone, either. There are people who can help you understand what's happening and give you tools to take care of yourself while your mom gets the help she needs. Elaine stared at the pamphlet in her hands, as though it were a foreign object, something she didn't quite know what to do with. What if I can't do it? She whispered. What if I fail again? Pastor Grayson leaned forward, his eyes steady and sure. Then you try again, and as many times as it takes. Because giving up is the only real failure, Elaine. Everything else is just part of the journey. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with the sound of breathing, of hearts beating, of the slow, tentative unfurling of something that had been closed for too long. And then, finally, Elaine nodded. It was small, uncertain, but it was there. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll try. Daniel squeezed her hand, and she looked down at him, her eyes filling with fresh tears. I'm sorry, baby, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Daniel didn't say anything. He just leaned against her, resting his head on her arm, and in that simple gesture, he forgave her 1,000 times over. Pastor Grayson stood, his expression warm and encouraging. I'm going to check in with you both this week, he said, and I'm going to connect you with some people who can walk this road with you. You're not alone anymore. Do you understand? Elaine nodded, clutching the pamphlet like a lifeline. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for not turning us away. The pastor smiled gently. This is the church, Elaine. We don't turn people away. We open the doors wider. As they left his office, stepping back into the quiet sanctuary where the light still streamed through the stained glass in shades of amber and blue, Pastor Grayson watched them go, the woman and her son, walking side by side, no longer quite so alone. And he thought about the boy's whispered words, about how sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths, about how courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage whispers. Sometimes it simply says, I need help. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. The days following that Sunday morning unfolded slowly, like the careful turning of pages in a book too precious to rush. Pastor Grayson kept his promise and reached out to Elaine on Monday afternoon, a simple phone call to check in and remind her that she wasn't invisible, that someone was paying attention. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice hesitant and raw, as though she'd spent the night crying or perhaps simply hadn't slept at all. He didn't ask for details. He didn't press. He simply reminded her of the resources he'd given her and offered to accompany her to a meeting if she felt too afraid to go alone. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then, quietly, she said yes. The first meeting took place on Wednesday evening in the basement of a community center on the edge of town. The room was modest, with fluorescent lights that hummed faintly and a circle of mismatched chairs arranged in the center. A coffee pot gurgled in the corner, filling the space with the smell of something dark and bitter and oddly comforting. Elaine sat in one of those chairs, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor, and beside her, though not in the circle, Daniel sat at a small table in the corner with a coloring book and a box of crayons provided by the group's coordinator. Pastor Grayson had offered to watch him during the meeting, and the boy had accepted without question, as though he understood that this hour belonged to his mother. The meeting began with introductions, and one by one, people shared their names and their struggles with a frankness that Elaine found both terrifying and liberating. These were ordinary people, teachers, mechanics, nurses, retirees, people who had fought battles similar to hers and survived, or at least learned how to keep fighting. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, her throat tightening, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. But then she felt the weight of their gazes, not judgmental, not pitying, but understanding, and she found the courage to say, "My name is Elaine, and I'm struggling with alcohol. I'm here because I want to be a better mother to my son." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then, as though on cue, the circle responded not with applause or platitudes, but with simple nods, murmurs of recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that she had taken the hardest step. After the meeting, a woman named Carol approached her, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and hands that had clearly known work. "It gets easier," Carol said, her voice steady and sure. "Not right away, and not all at once. But it does get easier, and when it doesn't, you call me." She pressed a slip of paper with her phone number into Elaine's hand, and Elaine held it like a talisman. In the corner, Daniel had finished coloring a picture. A house with a red door, a tree with green leaves, a sun with rays that stretched across the entire page. He held it up for Pastor Grayson to see, and the pastor studied it with the seriousness it deserved. "That's a beautiful home," he said. "Is that where you live?" Daniel shook his head. "No, that's where I want to live. A place where everything is okay." The simplicity of the statement, the honesty of it, struck the pastor like a blow. He knelt down beside the boy, meeting his eyes. "You know, Daniel, sometimes the home we want doesn't come all at once. Sometimes we have to build it, piece by piece, day by day. And it's okay if it takes time." Daniel considered this, his brow furrowing in thought. "Will my mommy be okay?" he asked, his voice small and fragile. Pastor Grayson didn't offer false promises or empty reassurances. Instead, he said, "I think your mommy is trying very hard to be okay. And trying is the most important thing. But you know what? You being okay matters too. It's not your job to fix her. It's your job to be a kid. Can you do that?" Daniel nodded slowly, though the weight in his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely sure what being a kid was supposed to look like anymore. As the weeks passed, a routine began to form. Elaine attended her meetings, sometimes with Pastor Grayson, sometimes with Carol, sometimes alone. She started seeing a counselor, a woman named Dr. Rivera, who specialized in trauma and addiction, and slowly, achingly slowly, she began to unpack the grief and fear and shame that had driven her to the bottle in the first place. There were setbacks. There were nights when the craving gnawed at her so fiercely she thought she might break. But there were also mornings when she woke up clear-headed, when she made Daniel breakfast and saw him smile, really smile for the first time in months. And in those moments, she remembered why she was fighting. Pastor Grayson, for his part, became a steady presence in their lives. Not intrusive, not overbearing, but reliably there. He checked in with phone calls and occasional visits, always asking how they were doing and never offering judgment. He connected Elaine with a local job placement program and helped her secure part-time work at a bookstore downtown, a quiet job that allowed her to be home when Daniel got out of school. He also enrolled Daniel in a support group for children affected by a parent's addiction, a safe space where the boy could talk about his feelings without fear of burdening his mother further. One Saturday afternoon, Pastor Grayson invited Daniel to help him with a project at the church. They were building a small garden in the courtyard, a place where people could sit and reflect, and the pastor thought the boy might enjoy the work. Daniel arrived with dirt under his fingernails from playing outside and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Together, they dug holes, planted flowers, and laid down stones to mark a path. The work was simple, meditative, and as they worked, they talked, not about heavy things, not about addiction or pain, but about baseball and favorite foods and whether dogs or cats made better pets. At one point, Daniel paused, his hands covered in soil, and looked up at the pastor. "Why are you being so nice to us?" he asked. It wasn't accusatory, just curious, as though he genuinely couldn't understand why someone would go out of their way to help. Pastor Grayson set down his trowel and sat back on his heels. "Because that's what people are supposed to do," he said simply. "We're supposed to look out for each other. We're supposed to notice when someone is hurting and do what we can to help. It's not about being a hero or earning points. It's just about being human." Daniel thought about this, his expression serious. "My dad didn't do that," he said quietly. "He left." The pastor nodded, his heart aching for this child who had been abandoned by the person who should have protected him most. "Your dad made a choice, Daniel. A bad one. But his choice doesn't define you, and it doesn't mean you're not worth staying for. You are. You're worth fighting for. Your mom knows that. I know that. And one day, I hope you'll know it too." They returned to their work, planting the last of the flowers as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard. When they finished, they stood back to admire their work, a small patch of color and life in a place that had once been barren. "We did good," Daniel said, a note of pride in his voice. "We did," the pastor agreed. "And you know what? Tomorrow, these flowers are going to need water. And the day after that, they'll need more. Taking care of something isn't a one-time thing. It's a commitment. But it's worth it, because look at what we made." That evening, as Elaine picked Daniel up from the church, she saw the garden for the first time. Her son led her to it, pointing out each flower he'd planted, his voice animated in a way she hadn't heard in so long. She looked at the garden, at the careful arrangement of stones and blooms, and then at Pastor Grayson, who stood nearby with his hands in his pockets and a gentle smile on his face. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than any prayer she'd ever spoken. "For seeing us. For not giving up." The pastor shook his head. "You're the one who didn't give up, Elaine. I just walked beside you for a little while." They stood there in the fading light, the three of them, and for the first time in a very long time, Elaine felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the distant, abstract kind, but the tangible, immediate kind, the kind that said tomorrow might be hard, but it would come, and she would face it, and she would not face it alone. The congregation began to notice the changes too. Elaine, who had once slipped in and out of services like a ghost, started staying after to talk with other parishioners. She joined a Bible study group, not because she had all the answers, but because she was finally willing to ask the questions. Daniel, who had been so quiet and withdrawn, began to participate in the children's ministry, making friends and laughing in ways that suggested he was beginning to remember what childhood was supposed to feel like. And Pastor Grayson, watching from a distance, felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but gratitude that he had been present for this moment, this transformation. But he also knew that healing was not linear. There would be stumbles. There would be days when the darkness crept back in, when Elaine would doubt herself, when Daniel would carry fears too big for his small shoulders. And so, the pastor remained vigilant, not hovering but available, a lighthouse on the shore, steady and bright, reminding them that no matter how fierce the storm, there was always a light to guide them home. 3 months after that first whispered confession in the church, autumn arrived with its usual ceremony, leaves turning gold and crimson, the air growing crisp, the world preparing to shed what it no longer needed and rest before the renewal of spring. The church on Maple Street mirrored the season, its old bones settling into the cooler weather, its congregation gathering more frequently as the holidays approached and the human need for connection intensified. It was during this time that Elaine faced her most significant test, and it came not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet, insidious whisper. She had been doing well, 63 days sober, a number she counted with the diligence of someone measuring out her life in manageable increments. She had kept her job at the bookstore, had maintained her attendance at meetings, had begun to rebuild trust with Daniel, who no longer flinched when she raised her voice or looked at her with that guarded expression that broke her heart. But sobriety, she was learning, was not a destination but a journey, and journeys were full of unexpected turns. It happened on a Thursday evening after a particularly difficult shift at work. A customer had been rude, berating her over a book that was out of stock, accusing her of incompetence in a voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. Her manager had intervened, but the damage was done. The shame had settled over her like a heavy coat, reminding her of all the ways she'd failed in the past, all the reasons she was unworthy of kindness or patience or grace. By the time she got home, her hands were shaking and the voice in her head, the one that told her she wasn't strong enough, that one drink wouldn't hurt, that she deserved an escape, was deafening. Daniel was at a friend's house for a play date, a small victory in itself, evidence that he was beginning to have a normal childhood. She had 2 hours before she needed to pick him up. 2 hours alone with her thoughts and the cabinet where she'd once hidden her bottles. She had thrown them all away weeks ago, poured them down the sink in a moment of defiant hope, but the craving didn't care about empty cabinets. The craving was a living thing, a beast that prowled the edges of her mind, waiting for moments like this. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the cabinet, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She could feel the pull, the promise of relief, the certainty that just one drink would take the edge off, would make her feel less like she was drowning. Her hand reached for the cabinet door, her fingers trembling, and she was on the verge of opening it when her phone rang. The sound shattered the moment, jarring her back to reality. She looked at the screen. It was Carol, the woman from the support group, calling for their weekly check-in. Elaine almost didn't answer. She almost let it go to voicemail, almost surrendered to the darkness that was closing in. But some stubborn, fragile part of her that refused to give up, made her press the button. Hello. Her voice was barely a whisper. Elaine, it's Carol. Just calling to see how you're doing. There was a pause, and then Carol's voice, sharper now, more focused. Are you okay? You don't sound okay. The tears came in, sudden and overwhelming. I'm not, Elaine admitted, her voice breaking. I'm really not. I was about to. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Carol understood. Where are you right now? Carol asked, her tone calm but urgent. I'm at home. Alone. Okay. I need you to step outside. Right now. Go outside, take a deep breath, and stay on the phone with me. Can you do that? Elaine nodded, even though Carol couldn't see her, and forced her legs to move. She walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, the sun setting in a blaze of color that seemed almost obscene in its beauty given how dark she felt inside. She sank down onto the porch steps, the phone pressed to her ear, and Carol's voice filled the silence. I'm proud of you, Carol said. You didn't do it. You called me instead. That's not weakness, Elaine. That's strength. They stayed on the phone for nearly an hour, Carol talking her through the craving, reminding her of all the progress she'd made, of all the reasons she was fighting. By the time they hung up, the urgency had passed, the beast had retreated, and Elaine felt exhausted but intact. She went back inside, closed the cabinet without opening it, and called Pastor Grayson. He answered on the second ring, and she told him what had happened. Not because she wanted absolution, but because she needed to say it out loud, needed someone to know how close she'd come to falling. You didn't fall, Elaine, the pastor said, his voice steady and sure. You stumbled, but you caught yourself. And you reached out. That's what matters. He paused, and she could hear the rustle of movement on his end, as though he were settling into a chair. Do you want me to come over? Or would you prefer to meet somewhere? Elaine thought about it, about the empty house and the lingering echo of the craving. Could we meet at the church? She asked. I think I need to be somewhere that feels safe. 20 minutes later, she sat in the sanctuary, the same sanctuary where Daniel had whispered his desperate words months ago. The evening light filtered through the stained glass, casting the room in shades of purple and gold, and Pastor Grayson sat beside her, not speaking, just present. After a while, she began to talk, really talk, about the fear that lived inside her, the fear that she would always be broken, that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be enough. And the pastor listened, as he always did, with the kind of attention that made her feel seen and valued and human. You know, he said when she'd finished, there's a parable I've always loved. It's about a shepherd who has 100 sheep, and one of them wanders off. The shepherd leaves the 99 and goes after the one that's lost. Not because the 99 don't matter, but because the one matters too. You're that one, Elaine. And the remarkable thing about grace is that it doesn't give up on us, even when we give up on ourselves. Elaine looked at him, her eyes red from crying. How do you have so much faith? She asked. After everything you've seen, all the pain and brokenness in this world, how do you still believe? The pastor smiled, a sad, knowing smile. I believe because I've seen what happens when people refuse to give up. I've seen miracles that weren't flashy or dramatic, but were miracles nonetheless. People choosing to get up one more time. People extending grace when it would be easier to walk away. I believe because I've seen you, Elaine. I've seen you fight. And that's a kind of faith, too. They sat in silence for a while longer, the sanctuary holding them in its quiet embrace. And then Elaine stood, squared her shoulders, and said, I should go pick up Daniel. The pastor walked her to the door, and before she left, he placed a hand on her shoulder. Call me anytime, he said, day or night. You're not alone in this. She nodded, and as she walked to her car, she felt something shift inside her, a loosening, a lightening, as though the weight she'd been carrying had become just a little bit more bearable. The next Sunday, during the service, Pastor Grayson stood at the pulpit and spoke about grace. Not in abstract terms, but in concrete, lived experience. He didn't mention Elaine by name, didn't share her story without permission, but he spoke about the courage it takes to ask for help, about the community we build when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, about the truth that none of us are meant to walk through life alone. As he spoke, Elaine sat in her usual pew, Daniel beside her, and she felt the words wash over her like a benediction. After the service, several people approached her, people she'd known for years but had never really talked to, people who had their own stories of struggle and survival. They shared words of encouragement, offered invitations to coffee, and in their kindness, Elaine saw the church not as a place of judgment, but as a place of refuge. She realized that she had spent so much time hiding, so afraid of being seen in her brokenness, that she had missed the truth staring her in the face. Everyone here was broken in some way. The only difference was that some had learned to let others help carry the pieces. That afternoon, she and Daniel worked in the garden they'd helped plant, pulling weeds and watering the flowers that had grown tall and vibrant. Daniel chatted about school, about his friends, about the new book he was reading, and Elaine listened, truly listened, without the fog of alcohol clouding her mind. At one point, he looked up at her and said, Mom, you seem happy. She paused, trowel in hand, and realized he was right. She was happy, or at least, she was beginning to remember what happiness felt like. I am happy, sweetheart, she said, reaching over to ruffle his hair. I'm happy because I'm here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. Daniel grinned, a wide, unguarded grin that reminded her of who he'd been before the world had taught him to be afraid. Good, he said, because I like it when you're here. They returned to their work, side by side, and in the quiet communion of dirt and flowers and sunlight, Elaine felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of hope. And that, she was learning, was enough. Winter came early that year, sweeping across the town with a ferocity that seemed almost personal, as though the season itself wanted to test the resilience of those who lived through it. Snow piled high in the streets, ice coated the sidewalks, and the church on Maple Street wore a blanket of white that made it look like something out of a storybook, beautiful, serene, and utterly deceiving in its quietness. Beneath the surface, life continued with all its complexity, all its mess, all its stubborn insistence on moving forward despite the cold. Elaine was now 6 months sober, a milestone that felt both monumental and fragile. She had learned that sobriety was not a smooth, upward trajectory, but a series of peaks and valleys, days when she felt invincible and days when she felt like she was hanging on by a thread. But she had also learned that threads, when woven together, could become a rope strong enough to hold her. Her support network, Carol, Pastor Grayson, her counselor, the people from her meetings, had become that rope, and she clung to it with a gratitude that bordered on reverence. Daniel, too, had changed. He was no longer the silent, watchful child who had sat in the pew with fear etched into his features. He laughed more, played more, and had even started talking about what he wanted to be when he grew up. A firefighter, he decided, because firefighters save people, and saving people seemed like the most important job in the world. Elaine listened to his dreams with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that her son's desire to save others was born from his own experience of needing to be saved. One evening, as the first major snowstorm of the season approached, Pastor Grayson called Elaine to check in. It had become a ritual between them, these check-ins, a way of ensuring that she never felt too isolated or too overwhelmed. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice warm even through the phone line. Elaine looked out the window at the darkening sky, at the flakes beginning to fall in thick, heavy clusters. "I'm okay," she said, and for the first time, she actually meant it. "It's going to be a rough storm, though. I'm a little worried about losing power." The pastor paused, and she could almost hear him thinking. "Why don't you and Daniel come stay at the church tonight?" he suggested. "We've got a generator, plenty of blankets, and I'm planning to be there anyway in case anyone needs help. You won't be alone." Elaine hesitated. The offer was kind, but it also meant accepting help, admitting she couldn't handle everything on her own. And yet, she was learning that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. "Okay," she said. "Thank you. We'll be there in an hour." By the time they arrived, the storm was in full force. Wind howled through the trees. Snow fell so thick it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead, and the world felt like it was closing in, shrinking down to just the small circle of light cast by the church's entrance. Inside, the sanctuary was warm and welcoming, lit by candles and the soft glow of space heaters. Several other families had also taken refuge there. Elderly Mrs. Patterson, whose heat had gone out, the Johnsons, whose young daughter was terrified of storms, and a few others who simply didn't want to be alone when the world outside felt so hostile. Pastor Grayson moved among them with quiet efficiency, distributing blankets, making sure everyone had water and snacks, checking in with gentle questions and reassuring words. Elaine watched him work, marveling at the way he made everyone feel cared for, and she thought about how much her life had changed because this man had chosen to listen, to notice, to act. He had no obligation to help her, no reason to invest so much time and energy into her family. And yet he had done it anyway, not because he wanted recognition or praise, but because it was simply who he was. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, the group in the sanctuary began to share stories. Mrs. Patterson talked about the blizzard of 1958, when she'd been a young bride and her husband had walked 5 miles through the snow to bring her medicine when she was sick. The Johnsons shared how they'd met at a church service, ironically, though in a different town, and how faith had carried them through the loss of their first child. And Elaine, encouraged by the openness of the others, found herself speaking about her own journey, about the darkness she'd walked through and the light she'd found on the other side. Daniel sat beside her, listening, and when she finished, he looked up at her with an expression of such fierce love and pride that it took her breath away. "My mom is really brave," he said to the group, his voice clear and certain. "She's the bravest person I know." Elaine's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, the kind that came not from pain, but from overwhelming gratitude. She pulled her son close, kissing the top of his head, and whispered, "And you're the reason I'm brave, kiddo. You're the reason I keep going." Later, after the stories had been shared and the candles had burned low, Pastor Grayson gathered everyone in a circle for a prayer. But instead of leading it himself, he invited each person to offer their own words, whatever was on their heart, whatever they needed to say. One by one, they spoke, prayers of thanks, prayers of petition, prayers of hope and sorrow, and everything in between. When it was Elaine's turn, she closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the circle around her, the presence of people who had become her family in ways she'd never expected. "I don't have fancy words," she began, her voice trembling, "but I'm thankful. I'm thankful for this place, for these people, for second chances. I'm thankful that someone heard my son's whisper and didn't look away. I'm thankful for every hard day that taught me I'm stronger than I thought. And I'm thankful for tomorrow, whatever it brings, because I know I won't face it alone." Her voice broke on the last word, but she smiled through her tears, and the circle responded not with words but with quiet nods, with hands squeezed in solidarity, with the shared understanding that they were all walking the same difficult, beautiful path. The storm eventually passed, as storms always do. By morning, the world outside was transformed, blanketed in snow, sparkling in the sunlight, quiet and new. The families who had sheltered in the church emerged blinking into the brightness, saying their goodbyes and making plans to check on one another in the days to come. Elaine and Daniel helped Pastor Grayson clean up, folding blankets and stacking chairs, and as they worked, the pastor said, I've been thinking. This community we've built, it's special. I'd like to see it continue. Maybe we could start a regular gathering, not just for crises, but for connection. A place where people can share their stories and support each other. Elaine looked at him, surprised. You mean like a support group? He nodded. Something like that, but broader. Open to anyone who needs it. What do you think? She considered the idea, turning it over in her mind, and then she smiled. I think it's a beautiful idea, and I think I'd like to help. And so, over the following weeks, they began to organize what they called the Circle, a weekly gathering at the church where people could come, share their struggles and triumphs, and find the kind of community that too many people lived without. The first meeting was small, just a handful of people, but it grew. Word spread through the town about the safe space of the church on Maple Street, the place where you could be honest about your pain without fear of judgment, where you could find help without shame. Elaine became one of the facilitators, sharing her story with new arrivals, offering the same grace and patience that had been offered to her. And Daniel, who had once been a silent witness to suffering, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that children are resilient, that families can heal, and that love, when it's fierce enough, can carry you through the darkest nights. Pastor Grayson watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had simply planted a seed. The growth, the blossoming, that was the work of the people themselves, the work of grace moving through willing hearts. He thought often about that Sunday morning when Daniel had whispered his desperate prayer, about how one moment of courage had set so many things in motion. He thought about how easily he could have ignored it, could have let the moment pass, and how different everything would be if he had. One afternoon, as he stood in the courtyard looking at the garden that had grown so lush and full, Daniel approached him. The boy was older now, taller, his face losing some of its childhood roundness, but still carrying that spark of earnestness that had always defined him. Pastor Grayson, he said, "Yeah, buddy, I wanted to thank you for helping my mom, for helping us." The pastor knelt down to the boy's level, even though Daniel was getting too big for it. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel. I'm just glad I could be there." Daniel shook his head, his expression serious. "No, I need to say it. You changed everything. You didn't have to care, but you did. And now my mom is happy, and I'm happy, and we have friends and people who love us. That's because of you." The pastor felt his throat tighten, felt the weight of the boy's gratitude settle over him like a blessing. "I think it's because of you, Daniel. You were brave enough to speak up. You started this whole thing. Never forget that." They stood there together in the garden, surrounded by the flowers they'd planted months ago, and in the quiet of that moment, Pastor Grayson understood something fundamental about faith. It wasn't about grand gestures or miracles that defied explanation. It was about showing up, paying attention, and doing the next right thing. It was about being willing to step into someone else's pain and say, "You don't have to carry this alone." It was about being human with each other in all the messy, complicated, beautiful ways that being human required. Spring returned to the town with all the drama of a resurrection. The snow melted, the earth softened, and the world exploded into color. Green buds on every branch, flowers pushing through the soil, birds returning with their songs. It was a season of renewal, of second chances, of the earth itself demonstrating that what looked dead could come back to life. And it was in this season that the true depth of what had been set in motion by a child's whispered prayer became fully clear. The circle had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as a small gathering of broken people seeking connection had become a lifeline for dozens, then hundreds, People came from neighboring towns, drawn by word of mouth and the reputation of a place where vulnerability was met with compassion rather than condemnation. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and slowly, painstakingly, lives were rebuilt. Elaine was not just a participant anymore. She had become a leader, a beacon for others who were walking the path she'd walked. And her transformation was so complete, so profound, that even she sometimes struggled to recognize the woman she'd become. But transformation, as she was learning, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter, and every chapter brought its own challenges. In late April, Elaine received a phone call that threatened to undo all the progress she'd made. It was her ex-husband, Marcus, calling from a number she didn't recognize. He was back in town, he said. He wanted to see Daniel. He wanted to be a father again. The sound of his voice, after 2 years of silence, sent a shock of cold fury through her veins. How dare he? How dare he walk away when things were hard and come back now that the worst was over? She didn't agree to anything on that call. She simply told him she'd think about it and hung up, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She immediately called Pastor Grayson, and within an hour, she was sitting in his office, the same office where she'd first broken down and admitted she needed help. He has no right, she said, her voice tight with anger. He left us. He abandoned his son, and now he wants to waltz back in like nothing happened. The pastor listened, his expression thoughtful, and when she finished, he said, "You're right. He doesn't have a right, but Daniel might want to see him." The words hit her like a slap. She hadn't considered that. She'd been so focused on her own anger, her own sense of betrayal, that she hadn't thought about what Daniel might need. What if seeing him hurts Daniel? She asked. What if Marcus disappoints him again? Pastor Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. Those are real risks. But denying Daniel the chance to see his father might hurt him too. It's a difficult decision, Elaine, and there's no perfect answer. But I think the question you need to ask yourself is this. Are you making this choice out of fear or out of love? Elaine sat with that question for a long time, her mind churning. She thought about all the times she'd acted out of fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of being seen. And she thought about all the times love had guided her instead. Love for Daniel, love for the life they were building, love for the person she was becoming. Finally, she said, I need to talk to Daniel. Let him decide. It was the hardest thing she'd ever said, relinquishing control, trusting her son to navigate something so complicated. But it was also the right thing. That evening, she sat Daniel down at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten countless meals, where they'd done homework and played games and talked about their days. She told him about the phone call, about his father's request, and she watched his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. For a long moment, he said nothing. He stared at the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, and then he looked up at her with eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years. Do you think he's different now? He asked. Do you think he's sorry? Elaine wanted to lie, wanted to tell him that yes, of course his father was sorry, of course he'd changed. But she'd promised herself she'd never lie to her son, not about the things that mattered. I don't know, she said honestly. I hope so. But I can't promise you he won't hurt you again. Daniel nodded slowly, processing this. I want to see him, he said finally, but I want you to be there too. And I want to know that if he leaves again, we'll be okay. Elaine reached across the table and took his hand. We will be okay, she said, her voice steady and sure. No matter what happens, we will be okay. Because we have each other, and we have people who care about us. We're not alone anymore. The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at a neutral location, a park on the edge of town where Daniel used to play when he was younger. Elaine insisted that Pastor Grayson be there too, not as a mediator, but as a presence, a reminder that they were supported and not navigating this alone. When Marcus arrived, Elaine barely recognized him. He looked older, worn, his face lined with regret and something that might have been shame. He approached hesitantly, his eyes fixed on Daniel, and when he spoke, his voice cracked. Hi, son. Daniel stood beside his mother, holding her hand, and for a moment, he didn't respond. He just looked at this man who was his father, but also a stranger, this man who had caused so much pain. And then, in a voice that was calm and measured and heartbreakingly mature, he said, "Hi, Dad." They talked for over an hour, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease. Marcus apologized, not with grand speeches, but with simple, halting words. He admitted he'd been a coward, that he'd run when things got hard, that he'd spent the last 2 years regretting it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask to come back. He simply said he wanted to be a better father, if Daniel would let him. Elaine watched the interaction with a mixture of protectiveness and pride. She wanted to hate Marcus, wanted to tell him he'd lost the right to be in their lives. But she also saw the way Daniel's face lit up when his father laughed at one of his jokes, the way the boy's shoulders relaxed just a little. And she realized that this wasn't about her. It was about giving her son the chance to have a relationship with his father, even if it was complicated, even if it was imperfect. Because relationships, she'd learned, were always complicated and imperfect. That's what made them human. As they drove home that afternoon, Daniel was quiet, staring out the window at the passing trees. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I can trust him again." Elaine glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You don't have to," she said. "Trust is earned, not given. And it takes time, but you can give him a chance to earn it if you want to. That's your choice." Daniel nodded, and they drove the rest of the way in companionable silence. When they got home, he went straight to his room, and Elaine found him an hour later sitting on his bed, holding the picture he'd colored months ago, the one with the house and the red door and the sun stretching across the page. "Are we there yet?" he asked, holding up the picture. "Is this where we live now?" Elaine sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "I think we're getting close," she said. "We're not perfect, and things aren't always easy, but we're safe. We're loved. We have people who care about us, and we're fighting for the life we want. That's something, isn't it?" Daniel leaned into her, resting his head against her shoulder. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's something." Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Elaine stood in the kitchen, looking at the cabinet where she'd once hidden her bottles. She hadn't opened it in months, hadn't even thought about it most days, but tonight, with all the emotions stirred up by seeing Marcus, she felt the old pull again. Faint, but there. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and called Carol. They talked for 10 minutes, maybe 15, and by the end, the craving had passed. She hung up, feeling shaky but victorious, and she thought about how far she'd come, how many battles she'd fought, how many times she'd chosen to reach out instead of giving in. The next Sunday, during the service, Pastor Grayson spoke about forgiveness. Not the easy kind, not the kind where you forget the hurt and pretend it never happened, but the hard kind, the kind where you acknowledge the pain and choose to move forward anyway. Not for the other person, but for yourself. He talked about how holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. How forgiveness was not about excusing bad behavior, but about freeing yourself from the prison of resentment. And as he spoke, Elaine felt something shift inside her. A loosening, a release, as though a weight she'd been carrying had finally been lifted. After the service, she approached him. "Thank you," she said simply. He smiled. "For what?" "For teaching me that it's okay to let go, that I don't have to carry everything." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes warm with affection. "You never had to carry it alone, Elaine. That's what all of this has been about." She nodded, blinking back tears, and then she walked out into the sunlight, into the warmth of a spring day that felt like a promise, and she thought about the boy who had whispered a prayer, about the pastor who had listened, about the journey they'd all taken together. And she realized that this messy, complicated, beautiful life was the miracle she'd been praying for all along. The years that followed were not perfect, but they were full. Elaine continued her work with the circle, watching it grow into a fixture of the community, a place where people knew they could come when the weight of life became too much. She celebrated milestones, 1 year sober, 2 years, 5, and on the hard days when the shadows crept back in, she reached out to the network she'd built, and they caught her before she could fall. Daniel grew into a young man who was kind and thoughtful, who carried the lessons of his childhood, not as scars, but as wisdom, who understood that strength was not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to ask for help when you needed it. Marcus remained on the periphery of their lives, never quite earning back the trust he'd lost, but showing up consistently enough that Daniel eventually built a tentative relationship with him. It was awkward and incomplete, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough. Elaine learned to let go of the bitterness, not because Marcus deserved it, but because she did. She learned that forgiveness was not a single act, but a practice, a choice you made over and over again until it became a part of who you were. Pastor Grayson continued his work at the church on Maple Street, growing older but no less committed, his silver hair turning white, his face etched with the stories of all the people he'd walked beside. He never sought recognition for what he'd done, never spoke about it publicly, but those who knew, those who had been touched by his quiet compassion, they remembered. They told their children about the pastor who had listened when no one else would, who had seen them at their lowest and loved them anyway, who had reminded them that grace was not something you earned but something you received. On the 10th anniversary of the day Daniel had whispered his desperate prayer, the church held a special service. The building was packed, filled with people whose lives had been changed by what had started as a simple act of noticing, of caring, of refusing to look away. Elaine stood at the front, her son beside her, now nearly grown, and she told their story. Not to boast, not to draw attention to herself, but to honor the truth that healing is possible, that transformation is real, that no one is ever truly beyond hope. 10 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear. My son whispered a prayer that saved our lives. He didn't know he was being brave. He just knew he needed help. And someone heard him. Someone listened. Someone acted. And that changed everything. She looked at Pastor Grayson, who sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face. This man taught me that grace is not passive. It's active. It's choosing to step into someone else's pain and say, you don't have to do this alone. It's showing up day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The congregation erupted in applause, but Pastor Grayson shook his head, standing and raising a hand for quiet. When the room settled, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just paid attention. I just cared. And that's something all of us can do. Every single one of us has the power to notice when someone is hurting, to reach out, to offer help. We don't have to be pastors or counselors or experts. We just have to be human. We just have to be willing to see each other, really see each other, and to act with compassion. As the service ended and people filed out into the afternoon sun, Daniel lingered behind. He walked up to the pulpit where Pastor Grayson stood, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. The boy who had once been so small and afraid, and the man who had refused to let him stay that way. I'm going to be a pastor, Daniel said suddenly, the words tumbling out as though he'd been holding them in for a long time. I want to do what you did. I want to help people the way you helped us. Pastor Grayson's eyes filled with tears again, and he pulled the boy, no, the young man, into a tight embrace. You'll be a wonderful pastor, he said, his voice breaking. Not because of me, but because you know what it's like to need help. You know what it's like to be seen. And that's the most important thing. They stood there in the empty sanctuary, the lights streaming through the stained glass in shades of gold and crimson and blue. And in that moment, the circle was complete. The boy who had whispered a prayer had become the man who would answer others' prayers. The mother who had been broken had become whole. And the pastor who had simply listened had set in motion a ripple that would extend far beyond anything he could see or measure. Years later, long after Pastor Grayson had passed away and the church on Maple Street had been led by younger hands, people still told the story. They told it to their children and their grandchildren, told it in hushed tones and reverent voices, told it as a reminder that the world is full of people who are hurting in silence, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care. They told it because it was true, and because truth, when it's rooted in love, has a way of enduring long after the voices that spoke it have gone quiet. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between words, in the moments when one human being reaches out to another, in the small acts of courage and compassion that go unnoticed by most, but change everything for a few, somewhere in all of that, The echo of a child's whisper continues to reverberate, a reminder that we are never truly alone, that help is always possible, and that sometimes all it takes to save a life is the willingness to listen. If this story moved you, please leave a like and subscribe. These moments of grace and transformation remind us why compassion, community, and courage matter. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone.